Here we go. Morning, folks. Oh, afternoon, folks. Hopefully you're expecting to be joining our safeguarding webinar, which is very kindly being run for us by Peter Cheer from Peter Cheer Consulting, our safeguarding guru. So it's Adult Safeguarding Week. What better time to have a reminder safeguarding webinar? Oh, I'm going to have to say it, aren't I? Please, can you go on mute as you're joining? Helen, can you mute everybody? And then I'll unmute myself.
Sorry, guys. Apologies.
Oh, marvellous. Well done. Thank you. All very well behaved. So yes, hopefully you're expecting to be at our safeguarding webinar. We've got a little bit of etiquette, so if you could obviously stay on mute while you're listening to our presenters. We would, of course, love questions and comments in the chat, really helpful. Also helpful, I think, for our presenters to know who's actually on the call and which organisation you're from. So if you could start popping your name and organisation in the chat, and if you want to tell us what job you do, that's also useful for us. We've just got quite a lot of people arriving. We had about 160 folks signed up for the session today, so could be quite a lot of pinging still, so apologies for the pinging. If you don't know me, I'm Liz. I'm the Policy Director here at the NCF, and I'm delighted to welcome you, and I'm even more delighted that we've got Peter and Jenny running the webinar for us. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over. Oh, one other thing, we will have slides, we will share them. If we get loads of questions in the chat that we can't answer, we'll try and do a bit of a follow-up Q&A. So please do pop your questions in the chat as you're going through. We'll do our best to keep an eye on them. I've got to leave very promptly just before the end of the webinar, so Helen will do the rounding up and thanking. I've got to go to another one, so that's all fun. And I'll hand over to Peter to get us started. Thank you, Peter.
Great, thanks Liz, thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks to everybody for joining us this afternoon, and particularly thanks to those of you who sent in some questions as part of your registration. That was really helpful in preparing the presentation for today. So I'm hoping you can all see the slides all right. I wanted to firstly say a bit about Peter Cheer Consulting. As the name implies, it's mainly myself, but sometimes with bigger projects I may be supported by colleague Bridget Waugh, who some of you may know, who was previously Chief Exec of what's now the Home Care Association. And there's just a few points of kind of things that we can offer, particularly in relation to today's topic. We've done numbers safeguarding adults reviews, health checks, looking at policies, procedures, documentation, for culture as well, investigation, some other things listed there. And I've also listed on the slide there some of the other places I may crop up. So you'll hear later on about my role at Friends of the Elderly. I also chair a safeguarding board at Midland Heart Housing Association. You'll hear a bit about some work I've done with the Institute of Public Care, and also occasionally I do some work with Anthony Collins Listers as a retained social care consultant. So that's about me and Peter Cheer Consulting. And to tell you about what we're going to be talking about today, we've got a series of safeguarding updates as per the agenda. I'm going to do a one-pager on the new CQC process, which I thought might be useful. I think all the policy stuff is hopefully going to be interesting, but I think the CQC process is probably high in all your minds at the moment. Janet Hawthorne, who's from Friends of the Elderly, will then talk about some work they've been doing to get feedback from people who have been the focus of a safeguarding concern. And there should be some time for questions and discussion at the end. So if I manage to keep to time, there should be 5 minutes for questions between myself and Janet, and then about 10 minutes at the end. I just fair to say there is quite a lot to get through. I'm going to go through it all quite quickly, but we'll send out some slides, and the slides will have some notes attached to them, which will give you a bit more detail, and there'll be web links, that sort of thing. So I said it's going to be quite speedy today, but there will be more information afterwards. And just in terms of safeguarding updates, I looked at the agenda again this morning, so that does look a bit kind of disparate, a series of different topics, but actually there is a bit of a theme which hopefully will become clearer as we go through. And the theme really is about the desirability of greater learning across the sector and more consistent approaches to adult safeguarding. I'm going to move on to the first of the update topics, and that is to update you on work around safeguarding adult reviews, which I think some of you may have joined the webinar we did this time last year, where I talked about this in a bit more detail and shared some details of a few different safeguarding adult reviews. When in summary, I'm sure you're all aware, these are reviews that are commissioned by local safeguarding adult boards when there's been serious abuse or neglect, often actually when someone has died and there's concern about how the adult was safeguarded. So there are about 200 commissioned every year, and we highlighted last year really that there's an awful lot within them that's useful learning for social care providers, but there's just not really a mechanism at the moment to share that across the sector. So one thing to say, there has been we've been able to progress that a bit over the last year, and in my role as an associate consultant at the Institute of Public Care, which works as part of Oxford Brookes University, we've actually written a short discussion paper on this very subject, which was published in May, and you can download it from the IPC Brookes website. And basically what we did there, we looked at 60 safeguarding reviews that had been published last year, and it was quite a brief, quite an informal process. It wasn't fully comprehensive. It wasn't really what the material sort of deserved in some ways, but we managed to draw out quite a lot of findings which were quite useful in themselves, and also particularly to put the point of view that it would be useful to have a more systematic process for this learning in future. So it's a nice short paper. It's only 9 or 10 pages, so it's hopefully not too much of a read. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to download the topic. So I'm not going to go do a lot of detail on it today because it is there and quite easy to read, but just to give you some sort of headlines, I suppose, things that might be just to kind of tempt you towards it. Of the 60 safeguarding adult reviews, which were basically selected at random, 37 concerned people who had been receiving a care service at some point during that review process. Generally speaking, the concerns weren't about the care services themselves, but care services had been important parts of people's support processes in the period being looked at. As I think I said last year, self-neglect and capacity were very common issues. A lot of issues were situations where capacity hadn't been assessed and perhaps should have been, or where conclusions about capacity had been reached which perhaps didn't look quite, with hindsight, perhaps quite right. So those were kind of common themes. There were 4 SARs which concerned unsafe handovers between services, 2 of which were hospital discharges and 2 were where people were moving from one care home to another. And we found 6 of the SARs, so 10%, where a care service had been cancelled by the adult or by a family member for the adult. And I suppose this was probably the thing that surprised me most from the work, actually, just how many there were in that situation. And there was, a clear pattern. People had been maybe going to a respite service, day service, having some home care. The service was cancelled for whatever reason. The person, was lost from sight. And later it transpired that during that period they'd been subject to abuse or neglect. And the safeguarding reviews were saying, quite often the point at which the service was cancelled, that could have been a point to, it was a lost opportunity to look at what was happening and check what was really going on in the person's lives. And then beyond that, we also identified 11 other recommendations within the safeguarding reviews which are relevant for care services, and they're all listed in the paper. So it is worth a look on if you're interested in this particular area. Just to bring the discussion up to date, though, there's quite a lot of activity now around SARs happening nationally. The Department of Health and Social Care has commissioned a second national analysis of SARs. The first was done by the LGA, and that covered all the SARs published between 2017 and 2019. And a new analysis now being commissioned is underway, and that's looking at all the SARs published since 2000. So it is a big piece of work that should, I think, be reporting next year. So that's really positive. More broadly, DHSC has said it will consider opportunities to strengthen the oversight of SARs. So it's recognised the issue. And at the moment, there's a couple of series of webinars which I'll put some information about in the notes. So the LGA the Partners in Care and Health programme is running some webinars on learning from SARs, and there's one, for example, coming up on learning from SARs around adult sexual exploitation. And Sky is doing some work funded by DHSC about sharing safeguarding learning, and that's including learning from SARs. And again, I'll put some information about that in the notes that go out after the webinar. So some good piece of work there. I suppose whether or to what extent any of that work will look specifically at things from the perspective of adult social care providers is too early to say, but it's really positive that that work is going on. And just wanted to draw your attention to one SAR which was published in August this year, and this concerned fatal fires. And there have actually been quite a large number of SARs into fatal fires over the last few years. So it's not an uncommon situation at all. So this was commissioned by a safeguarding board which covers 2 London boroughs, Westminster and Kensington and Chelsea. And they'd had a number of fires in the area in previous years, and in particular, during 2021, 2 adults with care and support needs had died in fatal fires at their homes. There were some parallels between them. So one of the people was in his 60s, the other was in his 80s. One lived in an extra care service and one lived in a private rented flat. They both had care visits on a daily basis. They were both quite heavy smokers, and they both had quite a complex range of health needs. One of them had a mild learning disability. The other had previously had a history of strokes, and there were questions about his memory. So they had a number of features really, which meant there was a significant risk around fire. And in both people, actually, the fire risk had been looked at to some extent. What then happened in both situations is their health deteriorated. They were in hospital for a period of time. They were discharged from hospital with much reduced mobility. And the fact that their mobility was much reduced, clearly increasing their fire safety risk, wasn't considered at that point. So there wasn't any review of their fire risk assessments at the point where with hindsight, it was clear they were at much greater risk. And sadly, it's tragically fair to say that it looks like in both cases, fires were started probably due to smoking materials, and in both cases, neither of these people was able to move away from the fire and to make themselves or to safe or to raise the concern. So I've included this really because it's a good example of, I think, where there's been a terribly tragic situation, but if you read the SAR, it has led to a lot of new thinking about how to manage these kind of tricky and difficult high-level fire risks. And there's some things which are organisational. So, for example, the discharge procedure from the hospitals in that area has been changed to take into account the fire risk. But there's been quite a very useful list of practical things done by the extra care scheme, for example, which have clearly reduced the risk for people in the future. So, for example, 3 people where there was a high risk, they now have these things called misting towers, which I think sit in the corner. And if there's a fire, they release mist, which gives a bit longer for help to get there. Other people have now got their telecare linked into their smoke detectors. So there's a good number really of practical things which have emerged from this. And I mean, because there's quite a lot in it, I've actually written a commentary on this particular case, which I'll circulate with the notes, because I think there's a lot in there which is potentially useful for housing and care organisations to learn from and think about in relation to fire safety. So it's just a good example, I think, really, of where there is useful learning from SARs which can be shared much more broadly than it probably is at the moment. So that's an update on SARs. Next thing I wanted to talk about briefly was safeguarding data. And we've had 1 or 2 questions about what's the trends around safeguarding concerns, etc. And there's quite a detailed source of data published by NHS England. I'll send links to it in the notes. There's a spreadsheet. This is completed on the basis of returns from local authorities every year. And it gives an overall picture around adult safeguarding activity. So one question we've had, as we go through, I've got a few questions on the slides which are in these speech bubbles. So first one, is the number of safeguarding concerns increasing? And you can see from the graph that the answer is yes, they are. The top line is the number of concerns received by local authorities, and that's increased by 61% since 2016. And then the bottom line is the number of Section 42 and other inquiries commenced as a result of those inquiries. And again, it's going up at a steady rate of a slightly lower rate. I suppose probably not a big surprise. Questions really are why there's been that increase. Clearly, there may have been an increase in the underlying level of neglect and abuse. But alongside that, I think we've got a situation where there's greater awareness, better reporting. We know some local authorities are widening the scope of safeguarding. So, for example, wanting to know about every unwitnessed fall, self-neglect, there's more awareness of that, and that now is involved in about 10% of concerns. So probably not a great surprise that the numbers are increasing there. Just to give you a bit more detail, I mean, there's a vast amount of detail in this data if anyone wants to look at it. Where the concerns are arising, and this is data for concluded Section 42 inquiries, which is where you get a lot more detail. So the biggest area, biggest location, people's own homes, then care homes, and you can see that's a fairly consistent picture over those 2-year period. And then there's a bit more detail for care homes, and I've given the detail for care homes just because it's easy. It's a clearly defined location. It's much more difficult to track information for supported living or home care, for example. And this shows the breakdown of different kinds of concerns and different kinds of Section 42 inquiries that are in care homes. You can see again increases in all the different areas. I think there's probably nothing hugely surprising in this particular data. You can see that there's fairly consistent increase across the area, but also there's more for each concern. On average, there's more different types of abuse being listed. You probably see these numbers don't add up, and that's because quite a few Section 42 concerns, cover more than one different type of abuse. And just the last line, service provider is a source. That's where the risk was thought to be due to the actions of the service provider and members of staff. So the others would have been concerns around actions of family members, other services, etc. And again, there is that consistently increasing pattern, which probably isn't a huge surprise. But we've also had a couple of questions which are about the variation of local safeguarding responses. So why does the safeguarding response vary, and have thresholds been used as a barrier to referrals? So if anyone's interested, I mean, there is a huge amount of detail in this data which illustrates just how inconsistent things are across the country, at least as far as they're reported. So there's an interactive part of the system where you can plug in any particular local authority, and I put in Worcestershire County Council because that's where I live. And this tells us how many safeguarding concerns were received by each local authority per 100,000 adults in the population. And you can see extraordinary levels of variation there. Worcestershire County Council 100, West Sussex 248, Buckinghamshire 2,800, and this is a group of councils who are felt to have the similar kind of demographics and personal and situations. They're kind of peer groups. So I mean, it just shows huge variation. It's hard to look at it and think that there can't be variation there in how the data is being recorded there as well. But equally, if you look at the data for Section 42 inquiries per 100,000 adults, which you just thought is more clearly defined, same picture really. Between Warwickshire and Wiltshire, there is a tenfold difference. It's just huge variations there, really. I suppose the questions are really what we should make of that, and I think from everyone's experience, they will see there is different approaches from different local authorities. There is a health warning here in the data which really says you shouldn't use it to make judgments about how local authorities keep people safe, and it talks about the fact they have different reporting practices used to discharge their statutory responsibilities. And I think I'm sure that must be absolutely true. I think the degree of variation in numbers really can't actually represent that degree of variation in practice. So I suppose the question is really, why is it potentially useful to look at this data? And I suppose my suggestion would be, if you are struggling with particular local authorities where there isn't a good response, or they're very particularly reluctant to accept a referral, there could be benefit to looking at this data and seeing how that particular local authority relates to others that you're interested in. So that might just be worth a look at. I said there is lots of other data in this set that you can look at. Another question in preparation for the webinar, which is, have others found that local authorities may block a referral if the person has got capacity, or if we're not sure? And there's data about capacity in here actually. So for section 42 included inquiries, one of the questions local authorities should report on is whether the person had capacity or not. And you can see that just over half of the people were thought to have capacity, about a third not, and then the others not sure or not recorded. So clearly, in practice, local authorities are accepting referrals from people who've got capacity, although anecdotally, I think we've all probably got experience where there's more hesitation perhaps if people do have capacity. So I suppose on the subject then of capacity, if that is the case, I've dug out a few points from the safeguarding statutory guidance which might be helpful in that regard. So 14.6 is the point of principle really, that statutory duties apply whether or not the adult lacks capacity. And then there's 2 or 3 later paragraphs which talk about situations where even if the adult has capacity and may not want anything to be done, actually the good practice in the expectation is that action would be taken. So 14.92, if the adult is being unduly influenced, coerced or intimidated, then the action should still be taken effectively. And 14.95, action may be needed if others will be put at risk if nothing is done. And that is actually quite a wide-ranging clause. So that would include situations where concern was about the actions of a member of staff or volunteer, or if the alleged abuser had care and support needs, or if there was a child involved in the situation. And the last one is if the adult is thought to be refusing intervention on the grounds of duress, then action must still be taken. And I suppose my suggestion would be that if you are in a situation where local authorities are reluctant to progress a referral on the basis of the adult having capacity and possibly not saying they particularly want anything to be done about the situation, not particularly suggesting you should kind of quote the guidance, but actually if you can actually make your referral and use this language in your referral, it should be the kind of thing which local authorities would recognise and progress with. So that's potentially useful from that point of view. And I suppose the other general point is that often capacity is not straightforward or easy to assess actually, and there's lots of SARs where that's been an issue. There's been a lot of discussion around executive capacity, and I'll put a link about that in the notes as well, which often if people they may appear to have capacity, but actually they can't actually execute the decision. Those may be situations that you're coming across. So again, that might be useful terminology to be thinking about when you are seeking to encourage local authority to take a referral forward. So that's probably enough on the data from the Department of Health and Social Care. I was just going to mention very briefly during the year there's been this review published by the government, which is a joint publication between the Home Office and the Department of Health and Social Care. And I think what was particularly interesting was that it recognised a lot of the things that we've been talking about here. So what it found was that the oversight of safeguarding was fragmented, limited learning opportunities, variation between areas, competing pressures, insufficient resources. So very much the kind of picture that I think has emerged from this kind of work and discussion over the last few months. There was an interesting discussion particularly about powers of entry, and quite a few SARs have raised situations where social workers would have benefited from having the powers of entry, which they don't have in England. In some other countries in the UK they do have, but not in England at the moment. So there are a range of government actions arising from this, including, as I mentioned earlier, the second analysis of safeguarding adult reviews, other actions around training resources. They're going to review the evidence on the powers of entry. I expect that's probably going to be quite a long-term process. and the department and CQC are going to consider how the review should inform local authority assessment. And I think that is all about saying when the CQC look at their reviews of local authorities, safeguarding will be part of that. And some of the variations, I would imagine, or we certainly hope, will be part of that particular process. So just on this general theme really of consistency and learning, it's interesting that this review, which is quite a wide-ranging review by the government, very much picked up on the situation that we've been talking about, and it's good to see some actions there to try and move that forward into a more consistent situation. And although the review was focused on care at home, a lot of it actually is relevant to situations in care homes as well. And if you want to read the report, I'll put a link in the notes. The report is quite long, actually, about 70 pages, but the conclusion is really gives you a good summary and list all the actions, and that's only half a dozen pages, so that's perhaps a bit more achievable. So the last sort of in this kind of set of updates, I was going to talk to you briefly about independently chaired safeguarding monitoring groups within not-for-profit care providers. And I suppose how this fits in is it's got potential to be a bit of something which may help to develop shared good practice and get to better consistency across the sector over a period of time. So just to recap, those of you who were on the webinar this time last year will have heard me and a colleague from Friends of the Elderly, Sue Smith, talking in more detail about this group at Friends of the Elderly, which is called the Safeguarding Adult Subcommittee. So just to give you a very brief rundown, I chair the subcommittee as an independent person. There are some other external members, there are a couple of trustees, there are relatives, and there are senior managers. So Janet, who you'll hear from very shortly, she's there as the professional safeguarding lead for the charity, and there are senior operational managers there as well. And the things that we do in that group really is there to provide independent scrutiny, acts as a critical friend, monitor safeguarding concerns, how they're being responded to, policies, staff training, etc. And we also help the charity to keep up to date, and then we report to the charity's trustees every year. And those of you who work for charities, I'm sure you're aware of the Charity Commission guidance on safeguarding, and this is a subcommittee which really I think is very helpful to the charity in being able to undertake and to follow the various different sections of the Charity Commission guidance on safeguarding. So I think one of the things is that there are a number of other charities also have similar groups to this. I think some of them are called boards, some of them are called committees, but they do broadly the same sort of thing. So what I wanted to really share with you that we now have a small forum. It's called the Third Sector Independent Chairs Forum, and this brings together people who chair these groups at the 7 charities that you can see listed on the slides there. And I think, the thing to say is it's a very small group. It is a few people getting together for an informal conversation a few times a year. But I think it's fair to say over the last year it's developed further. It's got 1 or 2 new members. It's becoming a bit more structured and a bit more formal, and it's got potential to link into some of these other structures that are looking at adult safeguarding across the sector. So in particular, I've put a bit of a picture there. To some extent, this is slightly aspirational, I suppose, at the moment. We're probably not quite there yet, but what we are doing is establishing links with the network of people who chair safeguarding adult boards. A much bigger network, obviously, there's 130 of them, I think, compared to 7 of us at the moment, but that's a link between the care provider sector and the people who chair the SABs, and also a link into the Department of Health and Social Care. And for example, they have a safeguarding forum which meets every month or 2, bringing together people from the SAB Chairs Network, from CQC, from the NHS, from the police, from the DHSC policy people on safeguarding, and recently they've agreed to invite a member of our Independent Chairs Forum to join that overall National Safeguarding Forum. So it is kind of early days, but it's potentially a useful link into the national discussions with a perspective from independent sector care providers. And what I was going to say was, I know that after the webinar I did this time last year, I think a number of NCF members were thinking about the possibility of establishing a forum of this kind, some kind of committee or subcommittee, however it's going to be phrased in their particular organisation. And if any of those have done that, and there are independent chairs from those groups, so we'd be really keen to have them to join our little group here, maybe a bit of a bigger group, more influential in the future. So if any of you present here, if your organisations do have independent chaired groups, then do let me know, and we'd be very happy to make contact and have a bit more of a chat, and hopefully the chairs can join the forum and sort of make it a bit more substantial on behalf of the wider adult social care sector. So that's the whole series of updates, kind of policy side, really partly about the variation, how learning is shared across the sector. I said it's been a bit of a sprint through, but there will be more detail on the slides that you can look at afterwards if you want to. And just before handing over to Janet, I thought it'd be good to have just 5 minutes on something which is probably uppermost in everyone's mind at the moment, which is safeguarding and the new CQC approach to regulation. And what I thought was, what's the best way of giving something potentially useful around this particular topic? I mean, the regulation, actual requirements aren't changing, but what is changing is the way that CQC will be looking at evidence to assess services. And I'm sure you'll be familiar with the 6 different evidence categories that they're going to be looking at. And what I've just included here is a few questions to consider under each of those evidence categories, this is not by any means a comprehensive list at all. There's other stuff you need to have in place. But these are things where we've done safeguarding reviews with organisations. These are questions that organisations don't always know the answer to, or if they do know the answer, it's not a positive one. So I thought this just might be a useful way of thinking about preparing for the new CQC arrangements from the safeguarding point of view. So looking at the different evidence categories from the point of view of the people's experience, do the people who support feel safe, and do you know if they do, would their family members know how to raise a concern, and would they feel confident to do so? Similarly, the feedback from staff and leaders, how confident would staff feel about raising concerns? And I suppose in general, a lot of people, staff, people supported by services, relatives, don't feel very comfortable about raising concern. It's a difficult thing to do. I've had conversations with people who say, oh, yes, it would be fine. And then you explore it further. Actually, they would be pretty reluctant. And also, how do staff who've raised concerns in the past, how do they feel the organisation has responded? Again, I've spoken to people who say, well, it wasn't a good response, and almost wish I hadn't raised a concern now. Partner feedback can be very useful. Talking to your local safeguarding team, health colleagues, how do they feel your organisation's safeguarding practices? How could that be improved? Observations, probably a bit more subjective there, but if you observe what's happening in the care service, does the atmosphere suggest people might be happy to raise concern? Processes, obviously loads of other processes, but these are things that aren't always in place in my experience. Is our concerns reviewed? Are trends reviewed? Is there reporting to board level? Are there processes to learn routinely from things that happen and from the wider sector? And does the audit, internal QA process, whatever it is in your organisation, does that cover safeguarding processes? Quite often it doesn't. And I suppose outcomes, how that fits in, how do people who've been the focus of a concern feel the concern was responded to, and were they happy with the outcome? And going back actually to the data from the local authorities, they have to answer this question, and most people apparently say they're happy with the outcome. But I think in practice it's a lot more complicated than that, and I will stop talking very shortly, and Janet will then talk in more detail about how Friends of the Elderly has taken some work forward to really try and find out in more detail how people who've been the subject of a safeguarding concern feel it was dealt with, and how they really felt about the outcome. But I think at this point then I'm going to stop talking. So we've got 5 minutes if there are any questions so far. Happy to have a go at those, or if not, then I'll pass over to Janet to talk about the work at Friends of the Elderly.
No questions?
Okay.
Okay. All right then. Okay, so as you've heard from Peter, one of the main functions of Friend of the Elderly Safeguarding Subcommittee is to reflect on our practice and agree on how we can continually improve. And we really want to learn from those who've had the lived experience, and we think they have the most important, powerful voice. One of the goals in our annual work plan of the SASC is to improve how we seek feedback from those who've been the focus of a safeguarding concern. And we really want to hear from the person involved how it felt for them and what we could have done better. So involving people and seeking feedback on safeguarding is not new. It's in the Care Act. And when we looked at the best practice in the area, we found some of the guidance quite old now, but we felt that it was still useful and relevant. So, for example, we used elements of ADAS and LGA's making safeguarding personal, and in particular their what good might look like guidance, and we particularly liked their I statements. And we also found Sky's toolkits really useful for looking at where else this had taken place. And like a lot of organisations, I suspect our managers in our homes and day services have been having those appropriate conversations and supporting people during and after a safeguarding, but we haven't always evaluated and learned from this as well as we could have, I don't think. So we wanted to make the process more structured and formalised, so that we'd eventually have enough information to reflect upon and learn from what people were telling us. We've recently reviewed our policy on seeking feedback in general, and we've included people safeguarding feedback as part of this. So it's at policy level as well. So moving on to the next slide, when we're looking at, building on what already works. So we had to start somewhere, and we chose to focus initially on closed cases and where the person who was the focus of the concern had capacity, or if it was more appropriate, where there was a relative with the right LPA or EPA in place. We already keep a central log of all safeguarding concerns, and we review each case as part of the safeguarding subcommittee. So there's already a written record with updates as the case progresses. And we decided that was also the best place to summarise the feedback conversation for future reflection and learning. It almost felt like a conclusion to the record, and one that included that most powerful voice. So we're aware that we're asking people to reflect on an experience that may have been very distressing for them or their relatives. And our main priority is to make sure that the person is as comfortable and feeling safe as they can be during the conversation, and that they're given plenty of time to think and speak about their feelings. We are careful we're not investigating the case again. That's not what this is about. So we started by drafting 16 questions, but we were really conscious that this was not about questions, but about the person and the conversation. We're very clear this was not going to be a tick box exercise where we just sit and ask question after question. And we also wanted to avoid professional jargon at all costs. So just to make sure we got the picture of the questions right, we did a little consultation with the people on the SASC, so that includes relatives and operational staff and the consultants. And then we agreed that the best approach was to group the questions into similar themes, just to enable a more natural conversation to flow. For example, one group of questions just fell neatly into the area around communication. So, was there consistency in who the person was able to speak to? Were updates given when people were told they would get updates? And was it in the right format with enough time to ask questions? Did we get back to the person when we said we would? That's a really important thing. So the idea is that those seeking the feedback equip themselves with the relevant themes and build on what they're being told to enable more of that natural discussion. And this really is about hearing what that person is saying about their experience. So we had some varying views about asking whether people were happy with the outcome of an investigation, given they won't have had access to the evidence gathered. And it's hard to know what could be done if somebody was really unhappy with the conclusion of an investigation, for instance. So we agreed on a similar but broader question as to how happy people were with what happened as the result of a concern. When we considered who should have the conversation with the person giving feedback, we thought about who was most likely to put the person at ease, make them feel comfortable, spot where they may have needed a break if they were getting upset or tired, for instance, and who would encourage the person to speak openly and freely. We want to hear what people really think. We don't want them to say what they think we want to hear. And who would be the best person to encourage the person who's the focus of safeguarding to speak most freely. We also needed to think about who was likely to have enough professional curiosity to engage sensitively in this type of conversation, who would be comfortable and most used to asking some of those more difficult personal questions with that individual. For Friends of the Elderly, we decided that would probably be the registered manager of our services. They know their residents really well. Most of our homes are not very large, and the registered managers are people carrying out the assessments and the reviews. They won't deal with things like complaints, for instance. In larger homes, that might be the deputy senior shift leader, and of course in some cases that would need to be considered on a case-by-case basis. So there are challenges and we need to think about the next step. So honestly, it can feel like taking small, slow steps towards embedding this. I like to think at Friends of the Elderly, we have an open, transparent and self-reflecting approach and culture towards safeguarding. But even so, there are not that many cases that our managers are engaging in this conversation all the time. Some managers still feel a bit uncomfortable with asking people to revisit a time that may have been difficult for them. We need to ensure that managers understand the purpose and the benefit of seeking the feedback, and that they receive the right level of support and mentoring throughout. Residents and relatives haven't always wanted to engage with us. Understandably, they don't want to go back over something that's very difficult for them. Some people we speak to are worried about getting somebody into trouble or causing a fuss. They just want to let things lie and move on. Sometimes people tell us that they're unhappy with other professionals who've been involved in investigations. And sometimes, because these are closed cases, these conversations are happening quite some time after the investigation. We can feed it back to the professional. Sometimes they may have moved on. But hopefully, you know, it can still allow for some shared learning. A bigger challenge for us, I guess, is how we involve people where it may be harder to engage and communicate with them. Those who lack capacity maybe don't have an advocate, for instance. I haven't necessarily got the answers to the challenges, but we will continue to walk towards this and reflect and learn. And hopefully that includes learning from other organisations who are doing this well. So finally, next steps for Friends of the Elderly, we want to be able to provide an annual evaluation and reflective report for our safeguarding subcommittee and also the Board of Trustees. To do this, we need enough cases really to draw out enough data and information to use for reflective practice. Part of that, it would be really helpful if we could gather some qualitative as well as quantitative information, for instance, to hear about overall satisfaction with the outcome for the person. So maybe some kind of overall rating system of some kind would be really good. And it would be great if we were able to gather the information in a way that enables some sort of article or report to be written in the future with a view to sharing the good practice and learning across the sector, although we recognise that's going to take some time to build up enough data to do this. So in some ways, seeking feedback from people who are the focus of a safeguarding, it does seem quite fundamental and basic. It should, and I'm sure already does happen. I'm not suggesting for a minute that we're unique in doing this. I know it's happening. But for me, if we don't, as a sector, evaluate, and as an organisation, but as a sector as well, if we don't evaluate and share and learn from what we're being told, it seems to me that we're leaving as incomplete one of the most important and valuable parts of the whole process. Really happy, if I can, to answer any questions.
Are you able to give us any sense of what you've heard?
So, I mean, generally, as I said, it's quite a small, slow start. And kind of getting the managers used to asking the questions in the right way and people feeling really kind of free to speak. It's been a bit slow. Generally, it's been quite positive. People are happy with how they've been kept updated, even if they couldn't always get all of the information they wanted. They were generally quite happy with the outcome. There are a few people that we've spoken with who maybe their expectations, I don't want to say they were unrealistic because they were really important to that person, but sometimes they've not had the outcome that they wanted. And sometimes that's involved family members as well. That's been quite difficult, and we've been able to maybe arrange some kind of mediation. Generally, it's been quite positive. The communication with people, that they get to, you know, if you promise that you're going to get back to them, if you promise that you're going to have a meeting with them, it's really important that you do that, because the worst thing for people, they tell us, is that whatever has happened, and then they don't really hear anything for ages. And that's the thing that really, really upsets people. And then sometimes by the time we have the conversation with them, you know, they're almost not done with it. I mean, it depends how serious it is as well, but it's something that I think needs to be, like I said, if you say you're going to get back to someone, do it, even if there's not that much information that you can give them at the time, just so they know they've not been forgotten, if that makes sense.
Yes, well, from a personal perspective, I can certainly agree with that. There's nothing more annoying than somebody telling you they're going to ring you or email you or do something, and you carve the time out and then they don't.
Yeah.
Particularly when it's about one of your loved ones. I can totally get that. Yeah. Yes. And how have the managers felt, really, overall?
Well, like I said, they've always, some managers kind of really embraced it. Other managers just said, we're already doing this. We do speak to people, we do support them, but it was explaining to them about the purpose, you know, how we could learn from this, you know, why should we do this? And it really is to share that good practice. So we just found it essential to make sure that we involve them in things like the questions and how they might group those into themes. And you know, I went to 1 or 2 managers' meetings just to explain why this was, you know, considered good practice. And once they heard other managers kind of embracing it, it kind of went on from there. I think there's still a bit of work to do, if I'm honest, for some managers. But I think once they start seeing the kind of learning, the reflection, the annual report, you know, all of that, I think they'll want to be part of that.
Yeah, so when's your first annual report going to happen?
I think it's in the plan for next year, Peter. It's going to take a while to build up. It's got to be purposeful. It's got to have some meaning to it. So I think we need enough cases. But
yeah, no, absolutely. And I suppose the only point I'd add really to Janet's comments there, it's one of those things that it's good to do in itself, but it's also good to be, you know, kind of be seen to be doing it, because it's actually another thing which promotes the fact there's an open and positive culture around safeguarding, and actually feedback really is important, and people do want feedback. It's just one of those many things really that can be done, I think, to create the right kind of culture for safeguarding within an organisation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm going to see if there's any questions in a minute. I'm going to have a quick check through the chat. But I think the other thing that struck me was just how useful that slide was on thinking about the new world, the new CQC world, because that you pointing out that doing it is important, but being seen to be doing it, because if you haven't written it down, you haven't, you know, recorded it, people can't talk about it, they don't mention it, it's not, no one in the regulatory world believes you've done it, do they? They've got to have the evidence. So I thought that was a very interesting set of questions for us to ask ourselves. We've just done a mega briefing on the CQC new world, which obviously within about 3 hours of issuing it needs updating. So I'm going to add this into an update when we send in December, if that's all right. Can I pinch your slide, Peter? Can I pinch your question? I'll credit you, obviously. Won't just pinch you.
I mean, I suppose just to reiterate, it's not a comprehensive list at all. So you know, under processes, loads of other stuff. But you know, like policies, everyone has a policy. Training, everyone's doing training. These are things that actually, in from experience, aren't always happening, or organisations may not know the answers to. So.
Yeah, no, I just think it's the reminder, isn't it? I mean, as you say, the regulations haven't changed, but how we segment, well, how we record and segment our evidence is changing, and that's really interesting for that, I think. Right, let me just have a look. I've got lots of people in the chat. We've got gazillions on here. Right, anybody got any questions? We've got 10 minutes while you've got the gurus. Anyone got any questions? I can't believe you haven't. No one else has got questions apart from me. This is your chance. Ooh. Okay, I'm going to ask you some questions. Who else apart from? Do you want to pop the slide up that said the NCF members that have got the independent safeguarding board group subcommittee?
Yeah.
Has anybody else got? Has anyone else got one that's independently chaired? Does anybody else want to think about? Anyone got any questions for Peter? Oh, here we go. Right, the flow, the tumbleweed moment. Oh, will there? Right, Sarah, I don't really understand. Oh, you mean to deal with the variation, Sarah? Do you want to pop on?
Yes.
Yes. Go for it.
Yeah, it's just that we have such variation across the different local authorities that we're involved with. I'm at the RBL, and it would be just interesting to know if there's ever going to be any moves to standardise the different thresholds, because they, like we saw in your slides, they vary so greatly. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, as far as I know, there's a couple of things I can mention. One is that in 2020, the Local Government Association published some guidance which aimed to get to a more standardised approach to this, and it was called something like I can't remember what it's called. It was basically what constitutes a safeguarding concern. I'll put a link in the notes. And this was aiming to address this particular issue. I think, I mean, simply say it hadn't worked awfully well, but I think it came out just at the start of the pandemic, so it got rather subsumed. So that there was a document published by the Department of Health and Social Care last year called Revisiting Safeguarding Practice. And again, this was trying to encourage local authorities to have greater consistency. And if you go back to what I mentioned, the Safe Care at Home review, I've kind of slightly glossed over that whole report, but there are quite a lot of actions that the DHSC have said they're going to take forward around things like additional training and resources to try and encourage a greater, more standardised approach, and also potentially, I guess, the fact that CQC are going to look at safeguarding responses as part of their inspections of local authorities may encourage that as well. But I suppose, I mean, whether any of that is going to have any significant impact, it's hard to guess, isn't it, really? And the reality is it's still a local service. There are different local circumstances, resource pressures, vary. There are different views about how to take things forward. But I mean, the point about thresholds, going back to the slide actually, which is still on the screen, about the Independent Chairs Forum and the fact that gives us a route to raise questions with DHSC. We have in our kind of initial letter to the department the question of thresholds, exactly as you mentioned there. That was kind of top of the list really of things which are apparent from and would be good for there to be more work across the sector on. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers the question, but it's
I don't, just out of interest, I think this is a really good point. I'm just wondering how much effort it is if you're working, Zara, if you're working across a number of authorities, just thinking about kind of how much effort it is to understand each approach and then respond to it. Can we quantify that effort in any way? Got any sense of how much of a palaver it is because they all do something different? I mean, I know they always all do something different, but got any sense of whether it's like twice as much effort or 3 times? What?
It's just you know, luckily we only have 6 care homes, although obviously we have residents who come from different local authorities, but it's just so widely different. It's and so that kind of filters through into internal reporting because of what's accepted in one local authority. Not so we're standardising within ourselves what we record and report for our internal governance. But
Yeah.
it's just such a variation, really. That's just a big thing.
Yeah. I feel like there should be an easy way to standardise. Maybe I'm just naive about it.
Yeah.
Peter, should we do some more lobbying? Oh, sorry, Sarah.
Well, I was going to say, what we've been looking at recently is some documentation that Norfolk County Council has put out on standardisation of thresholds for safeguarding for medication incidents, medication errors, and they've also done a similar piece of work on falls as well. So that's been kind of really useful for us as a kind of gauge mark.
Just feel like it should be simple. Peter, am I underestimating how simple it should be to make it standard? Why?
Well, I think nothing is simple when it's dependent upon 151 local authorities to interpret national guidance in their own way within. I suppose it's not the only area where, if you look at things like eligibility for continuing healthcare, which is, should be more of a national process, but there's probably still a fair bit of postcode variation. So I think it is something that should be more standardised, and apart from the fact that it's kind of issues for care providers who work across different areas, I suppose the more significant thing in some ways is that there's unequal access to safeguarding measures for individuals who may be at risk of abuse and neglect. And again, it may be that in practice it's not that different. People are still getting support, and it's just not being labelled as a safeguarding support by the local authority. So the actual professional social work practice may not vary quite as much as it looks if it does from the data, but equally there is an issue there that should be, it should be less inconsistent than it is at the moment, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. I just think you should expect the same level of service wherever you live.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh God, it can vary. Yeah, Francis says it can vary even within. Yeah. Well, we've got a bit of a way to go then. Hopefully your lobbying will help, Peter. If we can help you in any way, that would be good.
No, sure. Thank you. Yeah, it's just a start, I think. So
Debbie says they've got 4 care homes. Yeah. A lot of love for some consistency. If you can just make that happen, Peter, that'd be good. Thank you. Right, you've got 3 minutes. Anybody else for any other questions? Also that data. Oh, yeah. I don't know. A question. So point there from Andrew Ireland. The NHS data you were talking about. Was it NHS data?
Well,
data that came through from local authorities, but they compiled it.
Yeah, it's produced by the part of NHS England that used to be called NHS Digital, but it is a return from local authorities. So the returns go from the 151 local authorities with adult social services responsibility. So it is adult safeguarding in all areas that we're looking at there.
Okay, so they pull it together for the Department of Health and Social Care.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Lots of yes. So we all want to get rid of the confusion, please. The inconsistencies. Maybe we'll add that to this. I'm going to ask the CQC what they're going to do about that. It's a really good point. Mind you, having just read that they've classed Birmingham as good, strikes me as extraordinary given it's gone bankrupt. Anyway, that's another topic for another day. Okie dokie. Right, folks. I think that's it. I think I'm going to close us. I think I'm going to say huge thanks to Peter, Janet, Helen, who made it all happen. Thank you. And things will go out to you. I'm just sending you a few notes I've made, Peter and Helen, and to my colleague Jasmine, who's updating our mega briefing. Brilliant. Oh, thank you. Oh,